Close your eyes and imagine a man standing at the edge of certainty. He has read every book, mastered every argument, conquered every science of his age, and yet he feels nothing but doubt. This is the story of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, a brilliant philosopher, jurist, mystic, and restless soul, who shook the foundations of the medieval world with a confession: reason alone cannot save you. His life was not just a collection of thoughts in dusty books, but a storm inside a human heart. A heart that questioned everything. Is the world real, or only an illusion? Can logic explain existence, or does it collapse into silence before the infinite? What is the purpose of a life filled with wealth, power, and fame, if the soul remains hungry? Al-Ghazali abandoned prestige at the height of his career, leaving behind students, honor, and fortune. He wandered in search of truth, his steps carrying him through Damascus, Jerusalem, and even the deserts of solitude. What he discovered became one of the most influential spiritual philosophies ever written: the marriage of reason and revelation, of mind and heart, of the scholar and the mystic. Tonight, you will walk beside him. You will drift into the quiet landscapes of his thoughts. You will hear the soft echo of questions that still haunt humanity 1,000 years later. And as you fall asleep, you may just feel what Al-Ghazali felt, that beyond all doubt, only God remains. Now, breathe deeply. Let us begin. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift back more than 900 years, to a world very different from our own, and yet strangely familiar. Imagine a city at the very center of the world, glowing with lanterns that reflected off the slow, dark waters of the Tigris River. This city was Baghdad in the 11th century, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the heart of what later generations would call the Islamic Golden Age. At night, the air would be scented with spices carried by caravans from India and China, the hum of conversation blending with the gentle rustling of palm trees. Merchants crowded the markets by day, selling silks, perfumes, and fine manuscripts. By night, those markets fell quiet, leaving only the distant echo of a scholar reading aloud to a circle of students, or the low murmur of poets reciting verses in candlelit gatherings. Baghdad was more than just a city. It was a crossroads where cultures, languages, and ideas converged. To understand the world into which Al-Ghazali was born, we must understand this extraordinary moment in history. The Abbasid caliphs had made Baghdad not only their capital but also the intellectual heart of a vast empire that stretched from the edges of Spain to the mountains of Central Asia. From every corner of that empire, knowledge was gathered. Greek manuscripts on philosophy and medicine were translated into Arabic. Indian treatises on mathematics and astronomy found new life in the hands of Muslim scientists. Persian traditions of governance and poetry mixed with Arab storytelling and Bedouin wisdom. There was a hunger for learning, unlike anything the world had seen since the time of ancient Athens. The Caliph al-Ma'mun, who ruled more than a century before Al-Ghazali's birth, had established the legendary House of Wisdom, a library and academy that became the beating heart of intellectual life. Here, scholars from different religions, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and even Zoroastrians, sat side by side, translating Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy into Arabic. The spirit was not of narrow dogma, but of boundless curiosity. Baghdad's streets at this time were filled with debate. In the mosques and academies, theologians debated questions of faith and reason. Was the Quran created or eternal? Could human reason, unaided by revelation, arrive at truth? Could philosophy be reconciled with religion? These were not idle questions. but matters that could shake the foundation of the empire. Meanwhile, the philosophers known as the Philosopha heirs to Aristotle and Plotinus were arguing that reason and demonstration could unlock the secrets of the universe. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, whom Europeans later called Avicenna, had built entire systems of metaphysics, explaining the existence of God, the nature of the soul, and the structure of reality itself, using logic and philosophy. Their confidence in reason was dazzling, but also unsettling, for it seemed to some that they gave human intellect a power that overshadowed revelation. And yet, Baghdad was not only home to philosophers and theologians. Scientists studied the movements of the stars from the observatories built along the riverbanks. Physicians practiced medicine in hospitals open to rich and poor alike, developing treatments that would later be translated into Latin and taught in European universities. Mathematicians played with numbers, inventing algebra, refining geometry, and laying the groundwork for what we now call algorithms. The city was alive with knowledge, like a vast university without walls. In the midst of all this intellectual flourishing, there were also undercurrents of tension. Different schools of Islamic thought, the Mutazilites, who emphasized reason and free will, and the Ash'arites, who stressed God's omnipotence and the limits of human reason, clashed in spirited debate. Sufi mystics, meanwhile, wandered the city and its outskirts, speaking of divine love and inner transformation, often looking suspiciously at the dry logic of theologians. Baghdad was a marketplace of ideas, but also a battlefield of them. For ordinary people, life was no less rich. Pilgrims, traveling to Mecca, passed through the city. Storytellers entertained children with tales of genies and heroes that would later become the 1001 Nights. Artisans carved wood and shaped copper into intricate designs, while scribes copied manuscripts with painstaking care, preserving knowledge for centuries to come. This was the world that awaited Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali. Into this vibrant, restless, intellectually alive city, he would one day step as a young scholar. But for now, Baghdad was simply preparing the stage. The questions were already in the air, the clash between reason and revelation, the hunger for certainty, the yearning for deeper spiritual meaning. All of these currents were already swirling, like the river that wound its way past the city's mosques and palaces. It is easy, as you let your body relax and your mind grow still, to imagine Baghdad under the stars. Lanterns glow faintly in the distance. The streets are quiet now, but the echo of debates and poetry still lingers in the air. You can almost hear the murmur of a scholar reciting Aristotle to eager students, or a Sufi poet chanting verses about divine love. The city sleeps, but the ideas do not. They continue to grow, to wrestle with each other, to search for truth. It was into this world, a world of dazzling brilliance and deep uncertainty, that Al-Ghazali was born. A world that would shape him, challenge him, and finally be transformed by him. Far from the grandeur of Baghdad, in the small Persian town of Tus, a child was born in the year 1058. His name was Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali, though the world would come to know him simply as Al-Ghazali. Tus was no glittering metropolis, but a quiet town in the province of Khorasan, in what is now northeastern Iran. It lay far from the great capitals, yet it nurtured its own traditions of scholarship and piety. Al-Ghazali's father was not a wealthy man. He was a simple wool spinner, a devout and humble Muslim, whose greatest desire was that his sons should be educated in the faith. The story goes that his father, sensing that his life would soon come to an end, entrusted his children to a Sufi friend, asking him to guide them in both learning and virtue. This early connection to both scholarship and mysticism would shape the course of Al-Ghazali's entire life. From a young age, the boy displayed a sharp intelligence and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. Books were his companions, and he absorbed lessons with remarkable speed. Even in childhood, he felt the pull of questions that others might avoid. What is truth? How do we know what we know? What lies beyond the visible world? These were not idle curiosities, but deep stirrings of the soul that would never leave him. He began with the traditional sciences, learning the Quran by heart, studying Arabic grammar, memorizing poetry, but soon his studies grew more demanding. In Tus, he attended the local madrasas, where scholars introduced him to law, theology, and logic. His brilliance quickly outpaced his teachers, and before long, he was sent to study with the great masters of Nishapur, one of the leading centers of learning in the Muslim world. Nishapur was a city alive with scholarship, home to towering figures in law and theology. Here Al-Ghazali studied under Imam al-Juwayni, known as the Imam of the Two Sanctuaries. Al-Juwayni was a master of Asharite theology and Shafi'i law, a brilliant mind who combined deep piety with intellectual rigor. Under his guidance, the young Ghazali blossomed. He devoured texts on jurisprudence, mastering the intricate rules of Islamic law. He studied kalam, the science of theology, learning how to defend faith through reasoned argument. He wrestled with logic and philosophy, absorbing their methods while questioning their conclusions. What set Al-Ghazali apart was not only his intelligence but also his restlessness. He did not simply memorize arguments. He probed them, tested them, pushed them to their limits. He was not content to accept authority blindly. Already, the seeds of doubt and inquiry were taking root. He wanted not only to know what others believed, but to understand why, and whether those reasons could withstand scrutiny. By the time he was in his 20s, Al-Ghazali had become a recognized scholar in his own right. His mastery of law was so complete that he could argue complex cases with confidence. His skill in theology was unmatched among his peers. His sharp wit and eloquence made him a formidable presence in debate, and he quickly gained a reputation as one of the rising stars of his generation. And yet, even in these early years, there was a shadow growing within him. For all his learning, he began to sense that knowledge of the mind alone was not enough. Law and theology provided structure, yes. Logic and argument offered clarity. But still, the heart felt restless. Still, questions lingered in the quiet hours of the night. What if reason itself could not guarantee truth? What if human knowledge was fragile, like a glass vessel, beautiful but easily shattered? For now, he pushed those questions aside, immersing himself in study. But they would return, again and again, until they could no longer be ignored. Al-Ghazali was not simply a child of knowledge. He was a seeker of certainty, a soul unwilling to rest until it found a foundation that could not be shaken. And it was this hunger, more than anything else, that would carry him from the quiet lanes of Tus to the dazzling courts of Baghdad, and ultimately into the depths of his own heart. As you lie back, listening to this story, you can almost picture the young scholar bent over his books by lamplight. Outside, the wind stirs in the dark streets of Nishapur. Inside, a boy from Tus is filling his mind with arguments and laws, but also quietly dreaming of something more. The journey has only begun. In the decades after his studies in Nishapur, the young Abu Hamid al-Ghazali found himself swept along by the currents of destiny. His sharpness of mind and mastery of argument did not go unnoticed. Word of his brilliance spread far beyond the schools of Khorasan. and his reputation began to precede him wherever he went. The world of Islamic scholarship was vast, stretching across cities and empires. But it was also tightly connected, and news of talent traveled quickly along the same routes as merchants and pilgrims. Ghazali's name was whispered with admiration. Here was a scholar whose intellect seemed limitless, a man capable of not only mastering the traditions of law and theology, but of reshaping them with his own unique insight. It was not long before his talents brought him to the attention of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire. Nizam al-Mulk was not only a statesman, but also a patron of learning. He had founded a series of madrasas known as the Nizamiya, which became the great institutions of higher education across the empire. These schools were designed to train scholars, judges, and administrators, ensuring both intellectual and political stability. To attract the finest minds to these schools was both a matter of prestige and necessity. And so, when word of Ghazali's brilliance reached him, Nizam al-Mulk invited the young scholar to join his court. Imagine the young Ghazali making his way to the imperial court, carrying not just manuscripts but the quiet intensity of one who has devoted his entire youth to knowledge. In the presence of the vizier, he debated other scholars, and with each exchange, his reputation grew. His arguments were quick, his words flowed with eloquence, and his confidence was unshakable. He displayed not only mastery of the sacred law, but also a grasp of philosophy, logic, and rhetoric. Before long, he was named a professor at the prestigious Nizamiya of Baghdad, the very heart of the Islamic world's intellectual life. Baghdad at that time was not merely a city, but a stage upon which the greatest minds gathered. For a young man from Tus to be called to teach in such a place was a recognition few could ever hope to achieve. And when Ghazali began to lecture, the city listened. His audiences swelled, students gathering not just from Baghdad, but from distant provinces, eager to hear the rising star of their age. He lectured on law with a precision that seemed effortless. He could unfold the intricacies of Shafi'i jurisprudence, weaving together chains of precedent and reasoning with clarity that left his listeners spellbound. He argued theology with such subtlety that he could dismantle the positions of opponents in a single sentence, yet do so with elegance rather than cruelty. He spoke with a rhythm that drew people in, lifting complex questions out of the realm of dry debate and transforming them into living matters of the heart and mind. His mastery was such that people began to call him Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam. This title was not lightly given. It implied that his very person, his words and intellect, were themselves a vindication of the truth of the religion. In his presence, one felt that Islam could stand unshaken against any argument, any philosophy, any rival claim. But the life of a scholar in Baghdad was not merely about winning admiration. It was also about navigating the treacherous waters of intellectual conflict. Philosophers, theologians, jurists, and mystics clashed constantly, and the city was alive with dispute. Ghazali stood at the center of it all. He debated the philosophers, pushing back against their overconfidence in reason. He challenged rival jurists, displaying the superiority of his training. He dissected theological arguments with precision, showing both their strengths and their hidden weaknesses. And yet, for all his intellectual triumphs, there was something magnetic about his presence that went beyond argument. His lectures did not merely instruct, they dazzled. Students would speak of the way he seemed to draw the entire world of knowledge into a single coherent vision. He had a way of making the complicated appear simple, and the simple appear profound. His words carried a beauty that lingered in the mind long after the lecture had ended. For Ghazali, these years in Baghdad were years of triumph. He stood at the pinnacle of his profession, honored by rulers, admired by students, respected even by his rivals. He was young, celebrated, and full of intellectual vigor. He seemed destined to be remembered as one of the great scholars of all time, a man who had reached the heights of both worldly recognition and scholarly authority. And yet, even as the halls of Baghdad rang with his eloquence, a quiet unease was already stirring within him. For deep in his heart, beneath the admiration, beneath the title of Proof of Islam, a question was beginning to whisper. Was this fame, this recognition, this mastery of argument, truly the truth he had been seeking since childhood? Or was it merely another form of illusion, another veil between the human soul and the reality of God? That whisper, soft at first, would grow louder. It would shake his confidence, unsettle his mind, and ultimately bring him to the brink of despair. The young scholar who dazzled Baghdad was also a man standing on the edge of a precipice, though he did not yet know it. For the higher he rose in fame and recognition, the deeper his eventual fall into doubt would be. For now, Baghdad admired him. Students copied his lectures with reverence. Officials sought his advice. Scholars debated him and left with both admiration and unease. Al-Ghazali was at the height of worldly success, the very embodiment of intellectual triumph. But just beyond the bright light of his fame, shadows were gathering, shadows that would soon consume him and lead him into the darkest crisis of his life. It began quietly, like a tremor beneath the surface, a faint disturbance that no one else could see. Outwardly, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was triumphant. His lectures in Baghdad overflowed with students. His reputation as the Proof of Islam was secure. He was consulted by the most powerful men in the empire. To the world, he was a man who had reached the pinnacle of knowledge and certainty. But inside, something was unraveling. At first, it was a simple question that disturbed him. How can one truly know what is certain? He had mastered law, theology, philosophy, and logic. But each system of thought seemed to contain cracks. Every argument rested on assumptions that could be questioned. Every certainty seemed fragile when pressed hard enough. He began to feel that knowledge itself was like a fragile tower, built carefully, stone by stone, but resting on foundations of sand. These doubts grew stronger. He wondered whether the senses, upon which so much knowledge depends, could be trusted at all. After all, the eyes can deceive, making distant mountains appear small, or a stick half submerged in water appear bent. Dreams, too, confused him. In dreams, one can believe fully in what is seen, only to wake and discover it was false. What if waking life itself was another dream, and true reality lay beyond it? The philosophers had promised that reason could provide certainty, that the human mind could discover truth by its own power. But as Ghazali pressed deeper, he found reason circling back on itself, entangled in contradictions. Logic, so powerful in argument, could not reach the ultimate questions. How can finite reason grasp the infinite? How can the human mind, bound by time, comprehend the eternal? The more he relied on reason, the more reason slipped through his fingers like water. Outwardly, he continued to lecture. His voice rang with authority, his arguments dazzled. But inside, he felt hollow. His tongue spoke words that his heart no longer believed. He could defend theology in debate, but he wondered whether he truly knew God. He could analyze law with precision, but he felt the law no longer touched the reality of his soul. His teaching became mechanical, his eloquence a mask. The collapse soon moved from the mind to the body. One day, as he prepared to lecture, he found his voice failing. Words would not come. His throat tightened, his tongue felt heavy, His whole being rebelled. Physicians were called, and they told him it was a physical illness. But Ghazali knew it was deeper. It was the soul refusing to play its part in a charade. It no longer believed. He was paralyzed by doubt, unable to teach, unable to speak, unable even to eat without difficulty. The man who had once commanded the attention of Baghdad's greatest scholars now sat silent, his inner world collapsing. Fame, wealth, position, none of it brought peace. All felt empty, meaningless, as if he were living a life that was not his own. This was no passing hesitation. For months he wrestled with the crisis. Was there any knowledge that could not be doubted? Was there any foundation upon which the soul could rest securely? He tested reason, but reason failed him. He examined philosophy, but it too crumbled. Even theology, which he had mastered, seemed more a defense of faith than an experience of it. Everything collapsed, until nothing remained certain. And yet, in this darkness, a new possibility began to dawn. If reason could not provide certainty, perhaps there was another source of knowledge, something beyond the intellect. He began to sense that certainty might come not from argument, but from illumination, from a light cast directly into the heart by God. But at this point in his life, he was still trapped in the collapse, unable to reach that light. He only knew that the path he had followed until now had ended in emptiness. So he resolved to leave, to abandon his position, his fame, his wealth, and retreat into solitude. He told others that he was going on pilgrimage, and in a sense, it was true. But it was not a pilgrimage of the body alone. It was a pilgrimage of the soul, a desperate search for truth beyond the reach of reason. Imagine him slipping quietly out of Baghdad, leaving behind the throngs of students, the admiration of the court, the city that had once adored him. He traveled not as the proof of Islam, but as a broken man, humbled by doubt, stripped of certainty, longing for a truth that could heal his heart. The collapse that had begun in whispers had now become complete. The brilliant scholar was silent. The dazzling orator had no words. Only a seeker remained, one who would spend years in solitude, searching for what reason could not provide. It was in this collapse, in the loss of meaning, that Ghazali began the truest chapter of his life. For only in emptiness can new fullness appear, and only in silence can one finally hear the voice of God. The year was 1095, and in Baghdad, the proof of Islam was at the height of his fame. His lectures at the Nizamiya filled halls with eager students. His reputation had reached the ears of rulers and princes. His words carried weight, not only in academic debate, but also in the decisions of statesmen. If one measured success by worldly achievement, then Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali had everything a scholar could desire. And yet, within him, there was only silence and despair. For months he had battled his doubts, trying to continue teaching, trying to carry the burden of his title. But every day, the weight grew heavier. His tongue faltered. His heart resisted. He would rise to deliver a lecture and find the words strangled in his throat. He could no longer pretend to believe in what he was saying. He could no longer wear the mask of certainty. He felt as though he were drowning, caught between the expectations of the world and the emptiness inside his soul. Physicians examined him, diagnosing his troubles as physical illness. But Ghazali knew the truth. His body was rebelling against his mind, refusing to play the role of scholar when the heart had lost its conviction. What had begun as an intellectual crisis had now become a total collapse of his being. To remain in Baghdad, in the glittering world of debate and fame, would mean to live as a hypocrite, and this he could not endure. So he made his decision. He would leave it all behind. The position, the wealth, the admiration of students and colleagues. He would abandon it all. It was not an easy choice. For a man who had risen from modest beginnings, who had devoted every hour of his youth to the pursuit of knowledge, who had been lifted to the heights of honor, to turn his back on it all was to risk everything. Yet he felt he had no other choice. The life he was living was killing his soul. He framed his departure as a pilgrimage. To those around him, he announced that he intended to travel to Mecca to fulfill the sacred duty of Hajj. In truth, it was not only a pilgrimage of ritual, but a pilgrimage of the heart, a desperate journey in search of certainty. He knew that by leaving, he risked losing his prestige forever. In the competitive world of scholars, absence could mean obscurity, but he also knew that to remain would be to lose himself entirely. His family wept when he told them. His students begged him to stay. The court was bewildered that their greatest scholar would walk away from honor. Some whispered that he was ill. Others said he had been broken by doubt. Few understood that he was choosing, in that moment, not despair, but a kind of hope. By leaving behind what was false, he was opening himself to the possibility of what was true. Imagine him preparing to depart. Manuscripts and honors left behind. Wealth distributed. The great halls of the Nizamiya, where he had lectured to hundreds, now empty without his voice. The city of Baghdad, with its bustling markets and endless debates, fading behind him. He slipped away quietly, not in triumph, but in humility. The proof of Islam was no longer a public figure, but a seeker beginning again. It is easy to picture the scene. A scholar who had once commanded attention, now stepping into obscurity. The bright lights of fame extinguished, replaced by the uncertainty of the road. His companions, perhaps a few loyal attendants, walked beside him, but his true journey was inward. Every step away from Baghdad was a step away from the illusion of certainty, a step toward the silence in which he hoped to hear the voice of God. This decision to walk away from glory marked a turning point not only in his own life, but in the intellectual history of the Islamic world. Few men in his position would have had the courage to abandon what he had achieved. Fewer still would have recognized that fame and knowledge, when separated from truth, can become veils that obscure rather than reveal. Al-Ghazali's greatness lay not only in his intellect, but in his willingness to let go, to admit that the path of reason and prestige had reached its end. When he left Baghdad, he left behind more than a career. He left behind the person he had been. The professor, the orator, the debater, all were left behind. What remained was a seeker stripped of certainty, humbled by doubt, longing for a foundation that could not be shaken. As you let your body grow still, you can imagine the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance, the city receding behind him, the desert opening before him. The man who had been the proof of Islam was now simply Abu Hamid, a pilgrim wandering into the unknown. His journey outward mirrored his journey inward, for to walk away from glory was to walk toward God. The road stretched out before him, long and uncertain. From Baghdad, he traveled first to Syria, then to Jerusalem, then onward to the holy sanctuary of Mecca. For years he wandered, moving from city to city, mosque to mosque, living not as a celebrated scholar but as a pilgrim, quiet, anonymous, seeking not applause, but stillness. In Damascus, he found refuge in the great mosque, its vast courtyards echoing with the recitation of the Quran. its towering minaret pointing toward the heavens. Here, Ghazali is said to have spent long months in solitude, retreating to one of the small cells above the mosque. Imagine him there, no longer surrounded by eager students but alone with his thoughts, listening to the murmur of prayers rising from below. By day he read the Quran and reflected on its meaning, not as a theologian defending doctrines, but as a soul thirsting for certainty. By night he prayed, weeping for guidance, waiting for the light of truth to pierce his heart. From Damascus he journeyed to Jerusalem, to the sacred precincts where prophets had once walked. He prayed in the shadow of the Dome of the Rock, contemplating the long chain of revelation that had led humanity through ages of doubt and faith. He saw in the Holy City not only history but a mirror of his own soul, fractured, contested, longing for peace. In those quiet moments, he began to feel that knowledge was not simply argument but illumination, a light granted by God rather than constructed by logic. Eventually, he made his way to Mecca, fulfilling the sacred duty of pilgrimage. Surrounded by thousands of believers, he circled the Kaaba, his voice joining in the chant of Labbaik Allahumma, Labbaik, here I am, O God, here I am. In that vast sea of humanity, each person stripped of wealth and status, dressed in the same simple garments, Ghazali felt the leveling power of faith. Before God, there were no scholars and no kings, only servants seeking mercy. It was in this atmosphere of humility that he began to find healing. But his travels were not about places alone. They were about the inner transformation that comes from leaving behind the familiar and stepping into the unknown. For years he lived simply, sometimes in seclusion, sometimes in small communities of Sufis, the mystics who sought God through remembrance, love, and discipline of the heart. He learned from them that true knowledge is not merely to know about God, but to taste the reality of His presence. This was a knowledge that could not be written in books or proven in debates. It came through purification of the soul, through polishing the mirror of the heart until it reflected the divine light. Ghazali prayed, fasted, meditated, and remembered God in silence. He discovered that the intellect, though powerful, is limited, but the heart, when purified, is capable of receiving truths that reason cannot grasp. His years of wandering were not wasted years. They were years of renewal. The collapse that had silenced him in Baghdad was slowly being healed. He no longer relied on the applause of students or the logic of philosophers. Instead, he sought the certainty that comes from direct experience of the divine. The pilgrim's path was a path inward, and step by step, prayer by prayer, he was beginning to find what he had sought since childhood, a foundation that could not be shaken. When he finally returned, after nearly a decade of wandering, he was not the same man who had left. He was no longer the dazzling professor who defended doctrines with clever arguments. He was something quieter, humbler, but deeper. He had become a man who had tasted both the emptiness of reason and the fullness of revelation. He had walked through the desert of doubt and found the oasis of faith. As you breathe deeply and let your mind drift, imagine him once again on the road, the dust rising with each step, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. The great scholar who had once filled halls with his voice now walked silently, a pilgrim seeking not glory but God. In that silence, he discovered more than he had ever found in words. The pilgrim's path was not an escape from life, but the beginning of a new life, one rooted not in reason alone, but in the light of the heart. After years of wandering and years of silence, Al-Ghazali slowly returned to the world of books and thought. He did not return as the same man who had once lectured in Baghdad. dazzling audiences with his wit. He came back with scars of doubt and with a new determination to sift through all the claims of knowledge that had once seemed so solid. If his collapse had taught him anything, it was that human beings long for certainty. But certainty is not easily won, and so he turned his attention to those who, more than anyone, claimed to offer it: the philosophers. For centuries, Muslim scholars had engaged with the works of the Greeks Aristotle, Plato, and their heirs. These texts had been translated into Arabic, studied, debated, and absorbed into the intellectual bloodstream of the Islamic world. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, had built vast systems of philosophy, blending Greek rationalism with Islamic concepts. They claimed that reason alone, applied rigorously, could unveil the secrets of the universe, the nature of the soul, and even the reality of God. To many, their work was dazzling, promising a complete harmony between philosophy and religion. But Al-Ghazali was not so easily convinced. He had tested the power of reason in his own life, and he had found it wanting. He respected the brilliance of the philosophers, admired their subtlety, but he also saw their overconfidence. They claimed to climb to heaven by means of syllogisms and logic. But Ghazali suspected their ladders were built on air, and so he wrote his great critique, the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. In that work, he did not attack philosophy as such. He used logic against the logicians, wielding their own tools with devastating precision. He accepted that mathematics, astronomy, and medicine could achieve real knowledge. He had no quarrel with the usefulness of geometry or the accuracy of calculations that could predict the stars. But when philosophers moved from the observable world into the invisible, when they claimed to know the eternal and the divine through reason alone, he struck. The philosophers, he argued, overstepped their bounds. They claimed to know what they could not possibly know. They speculated on the eternity of the world, insisting that it had no beginning. They denied the resurrection of bodies, reducing afterlife to abstract immortality of the soul. They suggested that God's knowledge was limited, that he could know universals but not particulars. To Al-Ghazali, these claims were not just mistakes, but betrayals of revelation. Worse, they showed the arrogance of reason when it forgot its limits. His method was both sharp and subtle. He did not simply declare the philosophers wrong. He showed how their arguments, when pressed, fell apart. For instance, when they claimed the world must be eternal because an eternal God could not suddenly decide to create, Al-Ghazali asked, why should divine will be bound by human categories of time? When they denied bodily resurrection because it seemed irrational, he asked, what authority did reason have to dictate the power of the Creator? Again and again, he showed that reason, when it tried to grasp ultimate things, dissolved into contradiction. But his critique went deeper than particular arguments. His real point was this: reason cannot be the sole path to knowledge, because reason is finite, and the truths it seeks are infinite. Human beings are limited creatures. Our senses deceive us. Our intellect, though powerful, is bound by categories and assumptions. To claim that reason alone can lead us to God is like claiming that a candle can illuminate the entire sky. It gives light for a small circle, but beyond that circle lies mystery, vast and immeasurable. And yet, Al-Ghazali did not reject reason entirely. He did not call for blind faith or dismiss philosophy as useless. He believed in using reason as a tool, but a tool that must recognize its place. Just as a physician can heal the body, but cannot answer the question of why we live, reason can solve puzzles, organize laws, explain processes, but it cannot reveal ultimate meaning. That belongs to revelation and to the illumination of the heart. In this way, Ghazali sought balance. He was neither a simple traditionalist who rejected intellectual inquiry, nor a pure philosopher who exalted reason above all else. He wanted to put reason in its proper place, respecting its power, but exposing its limits. For him, the problem of knowledge was not simply about winning debates with philosophers. It was about rescuing the human soul from the illusion that logic could replace faith, that argument could replace revelation, that finite minds could comprehend the infinite. This critique echoed through centuries. It unsettled the philosophers of his own time, silenced some, enraged others. Later, thinkers in Europe would read his work, sometimes misunderstanding him, but always feeling the force of his arguments. To this day, his incoherence stands as a reminder that intellectual pride can become its own form of blindness. As you lie back and let the sound of his story wash over you, imagine the quiet figure of Al-Ghazali, once a brilliant professor, now a humbled seeker, pen in hand, writing by lamplight. Outside, the world argued and debated, but inside, he was cutting through illusions, dismantling the pretensions of philosophers, and reminding humanity that knowledge is not only a matter of the mind, but of the soul. Al-Ghazali's doubts had not been shallow ripples, but waves that nearly drowned him. His collapse in Baghdad had shown him how fragile human certainty could be. It was this fragility that shaped his reflections for the rest of his life. The question that haunted him was not only how to critique philosophers, but whether certainty itself was possible at all. Was there any foundation upon which the restless human mind could rest without fear of collapse? He began with the senses. Can they be trusted? At first glance, yes. The senses tell us the sun rises, that the ground is firm, that bread satisfies hunger. But closer examination reveals their unreliability. The stick in water appears bent. The distant star looks like a small spark, yet is larger than the earth. Our eyes tell us one thing, but later experience or reasoning shows another. If the senses, our most immediate guides, can deceive, then how can they be the foundation of certainty? If not the senses, then the intellect. Surely reason can rise above illusion. But here, too, he found fragility. For reason also depends on assumptions that may be questioned. We believe that every effect must have a cause. But how do we know this is absolute? Perhaps we assume it only because we have always seen events unfold in a certain order. Perhaps what we take as necessity is only habit. And if reason itself rests on such fragile habits, then it too cannot provide unshakable certainty. This skepticism reached its peak in his reflections on dreams. When one dreams, he argued, the dreamer believes completely in what he sees. The sensations of the dream feel real, the emotions genuine, the events coherent. Only upon waking does one realize it was illusion. But what if waking life itself is another dream? What if there is another level of awareness beyond this one, and we will only wake to it after death? If so, then what we take as certain might be nothing more than another illusion. Such thoughts would be terrifying to most. To Al-Ghazali, they were nearly paralyzing. They shook his trust in every path he had pursued. The law, the theology, the philosophy, everywhere he turned, he found fragility. Certainty seemed impossible. And yet, it was precisely in this recognition that he found the beginning of truth. For when every false certainty collapses, what remains must be real. In his writings, he described how, in the depths of his despair, he felt that certainty came not from reason, but from a light cast into the heart by God. This light is not the product of syllogism or demonstration. It is not something one can force by argument. it is given, like the rising of the sun, illuminating everything suddenly, effortlessly, undeniably. When it comes, doubt is dispelled not by proof, but by experience, as unmistakable as the warmth of fire upon the skin. This did not mean abandoning reason entirely. For Ghazali, reason could prepare the way, could clear illusions, could sharpen the mind, but certainty, ultimate certainty, was a gift. It came from beyond the fragile structures of human thought. It came from revelation and from the direct illumination of the heart. And so his skepticism was not destructive, but transformative. By showing the fragility of human certainty, he cleared the path for a deeper kind of certainty, one that rested not on human pride, but on divine grace. He discovered that true knowledge is not merely to know about God, but to know God, to encounter Him in the depths of the heart. As you listen now, you may feel the same rhythm he once felt, the rise of doubt, the collapse of old assumptions, and then the quiet dawning of a light beyond words. For Al-Ghazali, the fragility of certainty was not the end, but the beginning. It was the moment when the restless striving of the mind gave way to the stillness of the soul, and in that stillness, truth revealed itself. Al-Ghazali often returned to one of the most intimate and mysterious experiences available to every human being: the dream. For him, the dream was not a trivial curiosity of the night, not merely a jumble of images stirred by an unsettled stomach or a restless mind. Instead, it was a doorway, a metaphor for the deeper structure of reality, a mirror that revealed how fragile our certainty truly is. In the dream, we believe fully, and only upon waking do we recognize that belief as illusion. Could it be, he wondered, that waking life itself is nothing more than a dream from which death will awaken us? He pressed this question with characteristic seriousness. When you are asleep, he would say, and you see yourself walking down a road, or speaking to a friend, or even falling from a height, you feel no hesitation. Your senses in the dream are as vivid as they are in waking life. Your heart races. You taste. You feel. You suffer joy and fear, as though they were real. In the dream, you do not stop to say, "This is only imagination." You inhabit it fully, convinced that it is reality. And yet, the moment you awaken, the illusion dissolves. What seemed solid is revealed to be nothing. The people, the voices, the landscapes all vanish. If such a total illusion is possible in sleep, why should waking life be any different? Why should the sights and sounds we experience while conscious be exempt from doubt? Perhaps there lies above this waking state another level of awareness, one that will reveal what we now take as real to be shadows and phantoms. Just as the dreamer awakens into daylight, so too will the soul awaken after death, into a light that renders this life dreamlike. This was not a matter of idle speculation. For Ghazali, the metaphor of dream and waking carried an immense spiritual weight. It was a reminder of the veil that hangs between human beings and ultimate reality. To live in this world is to live behind a curtain, perceiving only dimly, mistaking the flicker of shadows for the full brilliance of the Sunday. Human beings cling to these shadows as though they were the whole of existence. Yet beyond the veil lies a truth that cannot be grasped until the soul awakes. This way of thinking invited humility. If life itself might be an illusion, then the pride of reason collapses. How can one boast of certainty when one's entire existence may be a dream? How can philosophers build towering systems of knowledge when the very ground beneath them may vanish upon awakening? The metaphor of dreams made skepticism more than an abstract exercise. It made it intimate, personal, undeniable. Everyone dreams, and everyone has experienced the shock of waking. In that common experience lay a profound lesson. At the same time, the dream was not only a metaphor for illusion, it was also, paradoxically, a metaphor for revelation. For in dreams, one sometimes glimpses truths that cannot be seen while awake. The prophets of old received visions in dreams, messages of guidance and warning. The Quran itself speaks of Joseph, interpreting dreams as signs from God. To Ghazali, this meant that dreams occupied a strange in-between realm. They showed us how we can be utterly deceived, and yet they also reminded us that God can pierce the veil and communicate beyond reason. Dreams humbled human pride, while also hinting at divine generosity. And so, when Ghazali wrote of dreams, he was speaking of something larger. He was pointing to the entire human condition, a condition caught between illusion and awakening. He wanted his readers and his listeners to feel the precariousness of their certainties, to realize that what they cling to as solid may dissolve. But he also wanted them to recognize that behind the dream lies reality, behind the veil lies truth, and that God alone has the power to wake the soul. To lie back now and let these thoughts drift over you is to enter the same rhythm Ghazali once knew, the rhythm of recognizing how fragile life can feel, and yet how hopeful it can be. For if this world is but a dream, then the pains and sorrows that weigh upon us are also part of that fleeting illusion. And if behind the dream lies truth, then what awaits is not despair but awakening. To live with this awareness is to walk softly, to see the world as a passing shadow, and to long for the dawn when the soul finally opens its eyes. Al-Ghazali had tested every tool reason could provide. He had mastered the art of logic, memorized the methods of Aristotle, and studied the commentaries of the great Muslim philosophers who claimed that intellect was the highest faculty of man. But when he pressed reason to its limits, when he asked it to provide absolute certainty, it trembled and fell apart. Logic, though useful, collapsed when it was forced to confront infinity. Reason depends on definitions, on categories, on the neat linking of causes and effects. To explain anything, it must place it within a chain. This caused that, which in turn caused something else. But what happens when the chain stretches beyond the limits of time? What happens when reason is asked not merely to explain the motion of stars or the properties of numbers, but to explain why there is something rather than nothing? At this point, reason circles endlessly, like a traveler lost in a desert without end. The philosophers had argued that the world must be eternal, for they could not conceive of a moment when nothing existed. If there was ever nothing, they said, then nothing could have come into being. And yet, if the world is eternal, then how does one explain the existence of God as creator? If God is eternal, how could he suddenly decide to bring the world into being? Reason falters, for it cannot comprehend a will that is beyond time. To demand that God's action conform to human categories is already to reduce the infinite to the finite. This was the collapse Ghazali witnessed. Reason could dazzle with arguments, but when confronted with the divine, its categories became useless. Logic could explain the properties of fire, but could not explain why fire burns cotton only when God allows it. Logic could argue about necessity and possibility, but could not explain how divine will sustains existence from moment to moment. At the edge of infinity, the candle of reason flickered and went out. This collapse did not make him despise reason. He continued to use it, to teach it, to employ it against the claims of philosophers. But he no longer trusted it as a final authority. Reason was a guide for the road, but not a key to the locked gate. It could take one far, but not all the way. To rely on reason alone was to build a house of cards in a windstorm. To recognize its collapse was to turn humbly toward revelation and toward the inner illumination of the heart. The collapse of reason also taught him something about human pride. Philosophers had often spoken as if their systems could contain the universe, as if their minds could measure the infinite. But their systems always ended in contradiction, and their pride always ended in failure. Ghazali's crisis had shown him that the search for certainty through reason alone leads not to peace, but to exhaustion. Peace comes only when reason bows before the infinite, admitting its limits and opening itself to the light that reason cannot generate, but only receive. To sit with these reflections, to let them sink into the quiet of your own thoughts, is to feel the same humility Ghazali wanted his students to feel. It is to sense the limits of the mind, not as a source of despair, but as a doorway to wonder. For when reason collapses at the edge of infinity, it is not the end of knowledge, but the beginning of wisdom. After years of wrestling with the limits of reason, Al-Ghazali found himself standing before an abyss. He had tested the senses and found them unreliable. He had tested the intellect and found it collapsing under the weight of infinity. He had examined the proud systems of the philosophers and seen them dissolve into contradiction. He had even scrutinized the tools of the theologians and realized they were useful for defending faith, but powerless to create certainty in the soul. Everything that once seemed solid had crumbled. And yet, in that very collapse, a new possibility began to dawn. A light, faint at first, but steady, growing brighter with each moment of surrender. He described this turning point not as the conclusion of an argument, but as the arrival of illumination. It was not something he reasoned his way into, not the result of clever syllogisms or careful proofs. It came suddenly, quietly, like a flame kindled within the heart. He called it divine light, a gift of God, the illumination that reveals truth with a clarity beyond all demonstration. Just as the sun makes it unnecessary to argue about its own existence, so too does this light banish doubt by its very presence. For Al-Ghazali, this was the answer to the problem of knowledge. Certainty does not come from piling up arguments. It comes from being touched by light. Revelation, both in the form of the Quran and in the form of direct illumination granted to the heart, was the only true foundation. Human beings can prepare themselves through study, discipline, and reflection. But the decisive moment belongs to God alone. He shines His light into the heart of whom He wills, and when that happens, the shadows of doubt scatter. This conviction did not mean abandoning intellect or turning away from study. Ghazali continued to read, to analyze, to engage with complex ideas, but he now understood that intellect was a tool, not a master. Its role was to clear the ground, to expose falsehood, to show the limits of human pride. But the ground thus cleared could only be filled by light. Revelation supplied what reason could not, a certainty rooted not in argument but in encounter. He often compared this to fire. You can describe fire in 1,000 ways. You can argue about its properties, measure its heat, analyze the chemistry of combustion. Yet none of this is equal to placing your hand close to the flame and feeling its warmth. True knowledge is like that warmth, immediate, undeniable, beyond dispute. It is given by experience, not merely by definition. And for Ghazali, revelation was the flame by which the soul was warmed, the fire that burned away illusion. This discovery reshaped his entire view of life. He no longer saw revelation as one system of thought among others, something to be defended with arguments in the marketplace of ideas. Instead, he saw it as the very light by which all else must be judged. Without it, human beings stumble in darkness, mistaking shadows for reality. With it, even the simplest soul can know God, with a certainty that philosophers cannot match. Al-Ghazali began to write again, this time with a new purpose. His works no longer aimed merely to display intellectual brilliance. They aimed to guide souls toward light. His magnum opus, Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, was not only a book of law or theology. It was a work designed to reawaken hearts, to remind readers that the essence of religion lies not in endless argument, but in transformation through revelation. It is important to imagine what this turning meant for him personally. Once, he had stood in Baghdad, honored, admired, but inwardly hollow. Now, he had walked through the valley of doubt, endured the collapse of reason, and emerged into the dawn of divine light. He was not naive. He knew doubt could return. He knew the intellect would still clamor for control. But he also knew that a foundation had been laid, a foundation that no storm could shake, because it was not of his own making. It was a gift. This is the lesson he wanted others to see. That certainty comes not from the brilliance of human minds, but from the generosity of God. Revelation is not a burden placed upon humanity, but a mercy. It is the lantern in the dark, the sun at morning, the flame in the cold. To turn toward it is to be healed of the endless restlessness that doubt produces. As you close your eyes and let these words drift, imagine the sense of relief Al-Ghazali must have felt. After years of debate, doubt, and collapse, he discovered that truth is not manufactured, but revealed. He did not need to invent light. He only needed to open himself to it. And in that light, his doubts fell silent, replaced by a peace that reason alone had never been able to provide. Once Al-Ghazali had recognized the light of revelation as the answer to doubt, he began to rethink the entire structure of human knowledge. If certainty does not come from reason, where does it come from? If the intellect falters, what faculty can carry the soul to truth? His answer was both simple and profound. The heart. Not the heart as mere muscle, but the heart as the spiritual center of the human being, the place where divine light is received, the compass that guides when all other instruments fail. He spoke of the heart as though it were a mirror. Left unpolished, the mirror reflects nothing. Covered with dust, it distorts and deceives. But when polished through remembrance, through prayer, through discipline, the mirror of the heart shines clear, reflecting divine truth. The intellect can question, can analyze, can compare, but only the heart, cleansed of its impurities, can directly perceive. It is the heart that knows God, not by argument, but by presence. This vision grew in part from his encounter with Sufism, the mystical tradition of Islam. The Sufis taught that the essence of religion is transformation of the soul, a journey from heedlessness to remembrance, from pride to humility, from self to God. They spoke of the heart as the throne of the divine, the place where God reveals himself to those who purify themselves. For Al-Ghazali, who had experienced the collapse of reason, this teaching resonated deeply. It gave shape to what he had already glimpsed in his own despair, that truth is tasted, not proven. He wrote often of taste, using the Arabic word dak, just as you cannot know the sweetness of honey until you place it upon your tongue. So too, you cannot know the sweetness of faith until your heart has experienced it. Arguments about honey may convince you that it exists, but they cannot give you its taste. Similarly, the intellect may tell you about God, but only the heart can taste His presence. This emphasis on the heart did not mean abandoning law or reason. Al-Ghazali remained a jurist, committed to the practices of religion, but he insisted that law without heart is empty. Reason without heart is dry. Ritual without heart is lifeless. The compass of the heart is what orients all else. It gives direction to intellect, purpose to law, and meaning to ritual. Without it, human beings wander aimlessly, mistaking movement for progress. He also understood that the heart is fragile. It can be corrupted by greed, darkened by arrogance, clouded by desire. A corrupted heart cannot serve as a compass, just as a broken needle cannot point north. For this reason, he emphasized constant vigilance, the daily work of polishing the heart through prayer, fasting, charity, and remembrance of God. The journey to truth is not merely intellectual but moral and spiritual. The heart must be purified before it can guide. Al-Ghazali's language about the heart carried both tenderness and urgency. He spoke of it as the most precious possession of the human being, more valuable than wealth, more powerful than reason, more enduring than the body. If the heart is sound, the whole being is sound. If the heart is corrupt, the whole being is corrupt. It is here, he insisted, that certainty dwells. It is here that revelation lands, like a seed planted in fertile soil. This vision was radical in its implications. It meant that truth is not reserved for philosophers, not limited to scholars, not the privilege of the educated elite. The simplest believer, whose heart is pure and open to God, may know truth with a certainty that the most brilliant logician cannot attain. In this way, Al-Ghazali democratized knowledge. He returned it to the heart of every human being, reminding the world that the soul, not the intellect, is the true guide. To imagine this teaching is to imagine a compass glowing quietly in the chest of every person. Some ignore it, wandering in confusion. Others polish it, orienting their lives by its direction. For Al-Ghazali, the task of religion was to help people rediscover this compass, to clear the dust, to align themselves with the light. Once the heart is set, the journey becomes clear. As you let these words settle into your own quiet, you may feel the wisdom of this truth. Your intellect can question endlessly, circling like a bird in the sky. But your heart, when still and open, knows where to rest. It points not outward, but upward, not toward endless speculation, but toward God. And in following it, the soul finds what reason alone could never provide: certainty, peace, and the sweetness of truth, tasted rather than argued. When Al-Ghazali stepped away from the brilliance of Baghdad and the echo of his own lectures, he entered into a world quieter, humbler, and at first unfamiliar. It was the world of the Sufis, the mystics of Islam. For years, he had debated philosophers and theologians, measuring arguments against arguments, intellect against intellect. Now, among the Sufis, he encountered a different way of seeking. They did not begin with definitions, but with silence. They did not ask whether truth could be proven. They asked whether truth could be lived, breathed, and remembered with every beat of the heart. At first, he observed. He saw their gatherings, where men and women sat in circles, reciting the names of God in low voices, repeating them until their own egos dissolved into the sound. He saw them practicing long vigils of prayer, their foreheads pressed to the ground in devotion that seemed to transcend fatigue. He watched them fast beyond what law required, not as a display of piety, but as a way of softening the grip of the self. He noticed how they wept when reciting the Quran, not because they were performing for an audience, but because each word pierced them as though it were spoken directly to their souls. What struck him most was their stillness. Unlike the restless debates of scholars, which filled lecture halls with sharp words and intricate proofs, the Sufis spoke little. They lived in remembrance. They seemed to carry within themselves a light, not of argument, but of presence. To Al-Ghazali, who had known the exhaustion of endless reasoning, this stillness was both unsettling and deeply attractive. It suggested that perhaps certainty lay not in multiplying proofs, but in stripping away distractions until the heart rested in God. The practices he witnessed were simple, yet profound. The recitation of the divine names dhikr was central. To repeat the names of God again and again until they sank into the rhythm of breathing was to reorient the soul. The intellect may wander, but the heart, guided by remembrance, finds its home. Sitting among these mystics, Al-Ghazali realized that knowledge of God could be cultivated not by building systems of thought, but by dissolving the illusions of self. The Sufis sought to extinguish the ego, to let go of pride, desire, and distraction, until only God remained. In their company, he learned that stillness is not emptiness. To sit in silence, repeating the name of God, is not to do nothing. It is to polish the soul, to sharpen its receptivity, to prepare it for illumination. He realized that their path was not in conflict with the revelation he had embraced, but its deepest fulfillment. The Quran itself spoke of remembering God often, of hearts finding rest in his remembrance. The Sufis were not inventing a new path, but walking deeply into the path already laid down. Gradually, Al-Ghazali began to practice with them. At first, his mind, trained in debate, resisted. His thoughts raced. He wanted to analyze each verse, each phrase, to argue with himself. But over time, as he practiced remembrance, he felt his thoughts slow. He began to notice the quiet between words, the stillness that came after repeated prayer. In that stillness, he sensed a presence greater than himself, a presence that needed no argument. The Sufi encounter was transformative. It showed him that faith is not only to be defended but to be experienced. To pray is not merely to fulfill obligation, but to open the heart. To fast is not only to deny the body, but to sharpen the spirit. To sit in remembrance is to allow the light of God to shine into the mirror of the heart. These mystics did not claim to have all the answers, but they carried themselves as if they had found what arguments could never deliver: a direct taste of certainty. For Al-Ghazali, this was the confirmation of what he had begun to suspect, that reason cannot save the soul, but remembrance can. The philosophers had promised clarity through logic. The theologians had promised security through doctrine. But the Sufis offered something more intimate and immediate: a living connection to God through practices of stillness and surrender. As he walked away from their gatherings, perhaps through the narrow streets of Damascus or along the quiet edges of Jerusalem, he carried with him the echo of their chants, the peace of their silence. He realized that he had found in them a way of being that answered his deepest hunger. What he had sought in books, he was now beginning to glimpse in the living presence of God within the heart. And from this moment forward, his life would never be the same. When Al-Ghazali began to write about the heart after his encounter with the Sufis, he reached for a metaphor that was at once simple and profound. The heart is like a mirror. This image, so ordinary and yet so luminous, allowed him to describe the work of spiritual purification in a way that anyone could understand. A mirror, when clean, reflects with clarity, but when covered in dust or scratched or fogged with neglect, it distorts and obscures. The task of the seeker then, is to polish the heart, to remove the dust of ego and desire, until it reflects divine truth as it was meant to. He explained that every sin, every indulgence in greed, anger, or pride, leaves a trace upon the heart. It is like a fine layer of dust that at first may seem insignificant. One grain does not darken a mirror, but over time, grain by grain, the surface becomes dim, and the reflection fades. Eventually, the heart may reflect nothing at all, its surface obscured by years of neglect. This, he said, is the condition of most souls, weighed down by distractions, unable to see clearly, lost in illusions, because their mirrors have grown opaque. But the good news, he insisted, is that the heart can be restored. Just as a mirror can be polished until it gleams, so too can the heart be cleansed until it shines once more. The practices of religion, prayer, fasting, charity, remembrance are the cloth and polish with which the seeker wipes away the dust. Repentance is the water that washes the grime. Patience and humility are the steady pressure that restores smoothness. Each act of remembrance is a stroke of the cloth, removing another trace of darkness. This metaphor gave ordinary practices a new depth. Prayer was no longer only an obligation performed at fixed hours. It was the act of turning the mirror toward the light. Fasting was not simply hunger, but a way of loosening the grip of desire so the mirror would not be clouded. Giving charity was not merely social duty, but the polishing away of greed that dulls the heart. In this way, every act of faith became a step toward clarity. Al-Ghazali described the polished heart as one that reflects truth directly. Just as a clean mirror reflects the sun without distortion, so too does the purified heart reflect the light of God without confusion. In this state, knowledge is no longer a matter of argument, but of vision. The seeker does not merely know about God. He sees with the heart, experiences presence, and tastes certainty. The image of polishing also carried a warning. Just as mirrors, left unattended, quickly gather dust again, so too does the heart require constant care. One cannot polish once and be done. The work is daily, continuous, lifelong. Each day brings new desires, new distractions, new stains that must be wiped away. The seeker who neglects this work soon finds the heart dim once more. For this reason, Al-Ghazali emphasized vigilance. To live spiritually is to live attentively, always aware of the state of the mirror, always ready to polish again. What makes this metaphor so powerful is its gentleness. It does not describe the heart as something broken beyond repair, or as something that must be replaced. It describes it as something already beautiful, already capable of reflecting divine truth, but hidden under layers of neglect. The task is not to create a new heart, but to reveal the one already given. In this way, Al-Ghazali invited every person, no matter how far they had strayed, to return to the work of polishing. Imagine him writing these words late at night, the lamp flickering beside him, the pen moving slowly across the page. He was not writing only for scholars, but for seekers, for ordinary people struggling with distraction, pride, or despair. His words were a reminder that clarity is possible, that the light of God is always shining, and that the only task is to prepare the heart to receive it. As you rest and listen, you may feel this image working upon you. The heart, like a mirror, reflecting or obscuring. The gentle act of polishing, day by day, through prayer, patience, and remembrance. The slow return of clarity until light floods in. To live in this way is to carry within you a mirror of the divine, a compass of truth, a clarity that no doubt can disturb. This was the gift Al-Ghazali wanted to give the world. The knowledge that certainty comes not from argument, but from a heart made clear, a heart polished until it reflects God Himself. When Al-Ghazali finally emerged from his years of wandering and silence, he returned not as the young professor dazzling Baghdad with his sharp logic, but as a man tempered by doubt, humbled by solitude, and illuminated by experience. He no longer sought fame or applause. What he sought instead was renewal not only for himself, but for the faith that had shaped his world. The Islamic community of his time, he felt, was alive in form but often weary in spirit. Scholars debated law with precision. Theologians defended doctrines with vigor, and philosophers speculated on the nature of the cosmos. Yet something vital seemed to have been lost. Religion, he believed, had become brittle, reduced either to legalism without heart or mysticism without structure. It needed to be revived, to be brought back to life in all its depth and beauty. This conviction gave birth to his monumental work, the Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. To call it a book is almost too small a word. It was a vast ocean of knowledge, spread across 4 volumes, covering the outer practices of Islam and the inner transformation of the soul. Al-Ghazali did not simply wish to summarize. He wished to weave together everything that made faith whole. He wanted to show how law, theology, ethics, and spirituality were not separate compartments, but threads of a single fabric. He began with the basic practices: prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage. He explained their rules with the clarity of a jurist. But he did not stop there. He asked, what is the meaning behind these practices? Why do they matter? What do they do to the heart? He spoke of prayer not only as an obligation, but as a meeting with God 5 times a day, a rhythm that turns ordinary life into continual remembrance. He spoke of fasting not merely as abstaining from food and drink, but as a discipline that tames desire and reminds the soul of its dependence. He spoke of charity not only as redistribution of wealth, but as purification, freeing the giver from greed and binding the community together in mercy. At every step, he pressed beyond form into meaning. He feared that religion had become an empty shell, practiced outwardly, but hollow inwardly. His revival sought to restore the kernel within the shell, the spirit within the ritual. A prayer without presence, he said, is like a body without a soul. A fast without reflection is like hunger without purpose. A pilgrimage without humility is like a journey without destination. What mattered was not only the act, but the transformation it brought about in the heart. He also wrote of the diseases of the soul: pride, greed, envy, anger, hypocrisy. These, he said, are like poisons that corrupt the heart and cloud the mirror of the spirit. To revive religion was not merely to defend it against external threats, but to heal it from within, to restore purity to the heart. For every disease he prescribed a cure: for pride, humility; for greed, generosity; for anger, patience. His language was often tender, as though speaking to patients in need of gentle guidance. He knew that true revival was not achieved through condemnation, but through compassion; not through scolding, but through leading people back to the light. The revival became more than a book. It became a movement. It spread across the Muslim world, copied and studied, quoted and lived. It reached jurists and mystics alike, reminding them that faith cannot survive on outer form alone, nor on inner feeling alone. It requires both. For centuries after, the Ihya remained a companion to scholars and seekers, recited in mosques, read in homes, memorized by students. It became a lantern, illuminating a path that joined practice and presence, ritual and meaning, law and spirit. What made it so enduring was Al-Ghazali's sincerity. He did not write as one seeking glory, but as one who had tasted collapse and been revived by light. His words carried the authority of experience. They were not abstract theories, but guidance born of a soul that had known emptiness and fullness. When he wrote of prayer as a meeting with God, it was because he had prayed in solitude, until his heart trembled. When he wrote of humility, it was because he had been stripped of fame and found peace in obscurity. The revival he spoke of was not theoretical. It was lived. As you listen now, imagine the quiet labor of this man, sitting in the flicker of candlelight, writing page after page, weaving together law and mysticism, ritual and heart. His pen did not race but flowed steadily, like a river carrying nourishment to fields in need. His revival was not sudden thunder but gentle rain, soaking the earth until new life sprang forth. Through his words, religion breathed again, its spirit restored, its beauty made visible to generations yet to come. Al-Ghazali's great achievement was not simply to critique philosophers or to inspire mystics. It was to bring balance where imbalance had reigned. In his time, he saw religion threatened by two extremes. On one side, scholars of law who reduced faith to rules, stripping practice of its soul. On the other, mystics who sometimes abandoned the law altogether, seeking ecstasy without discipline, visions without structure. To revive religion meant to restore harmony, to show that law and spirit are not rivals but companions. He spoke of law, the Sharia, as the path, the road upon which the traveler walks. Without the road, the journey collapses into confusion. The rituals of prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage are like milestones that guide the traveler, preventing him from losing direction. They shape life, giving it rhythm and order. They bind the community together, reminding each person that they are part of something larger than themselves. But if one walks the road without looking at the horizon, the path becomes mechanical. Ritual becomes habit. The traveler moves, but without longing, without love. And so he spoke also of spirit of mysticism, of remembrance, of the inner life. The spirit is the horizon, the destination, the longing that gives meaning to each step. It is the breath of sincerity in prayer, the hunger for God in fasting, the humility of the pilgrim before the Kaaba. Without this spirit, law becomes dry, brittle, lifeless. But without law, spirit becomes chaotic, unmoored. Mysticism without discipline can dissolve into mere emotion, into wild claims and unrestrained visions that lead seekers astray. The balance, he insisted, is what makes religion whole. Law provides form. Spirit provides meaning. Together they create a vessel filled with life. He described it like a body and a soul. The body without the soul is a corpse. The soul without the body is incomplete. But together they make a living human being. In the same way, law without spirit is a shell, and spirit without law is a shadow. Faith is alive only when both are joined. This teaching had profound implications. It meant that the mystic in seclusion and the jurist in the courtroom were not meant to be enemies. Each had part of the truth, but not the whole. The jurist needed to remember that rituals are not ends in themselves, but means to purify the heart. The mystic needed to remember that the structure of law protects sincerity from illusion, guiding the soul safely through the dangers of pride and false inspiration. Both needed each other. Al-Ghazali himself embodied this balance. He remained a scholar of law, trained in the Shafi'i school, careful in his practice of jurisprudence. But he was also a Sufi, a man of remembrance and silence, a seeker of illumination. His own life was a bridge between these worlds. By walking it, he showed others that harmony was possible, that one need not choose between ritual and mysticism, between law and spirit. One could embrace both, and in doing so, embrace the fullness of religion. As the revival spread, this balance began to heal divisions in the Muslim world. Those who had dismissed Sufis as innovators found themselves moved by Al-Ghazali's defense of their practices, rooted in revelation and aimed at purification. Those who had dismissed jurists as rigid formalists found themselves reminded that law without heart is not the goal of Islam. Slowly, his words softened the barriers, reminding scholars and mystics alike that they were seeking the same God, walking the same path. Though often with different emphases, his message still speaks across centuries. In every age, religion risks imbalance. Some cling to rituals, forgetting their meaning. Others pursue inner experience, neglecting discipline. Al-Ghazali's voice calls across time. Hold both together. Let law guide your steps. Let spirit give you wings. Let rituals shape your day. Let longing shape your heart. For only in this union does faith breathe fully. Only in this balance does the soul find peace. As you rest and let these words settle, imagine the traveler on the road. The milestones are clear. The path is firm. But above the road shines a horizon of light, drawing the traveler onward. Each step is guided by form, yet lifted by longing. This is the balance Al-Ghazali sought to restore, the balance he called his generation to embrace, the balance that continues to offer guidance for any soul weary of extremes and longing for wholeness. When Al-Ghazali turned his pen against the philosophers, he did not do so as an outsider, sneering from the margins. He was a man who had studied their works, absorbed their systems, and mastered their methods. He had read Aristotle through the translations and commentaries of Muslim thinkers. He had studied Avicenna's grand synthesis of Greek thought and Islamic theology. He knew their logic and their claims from within. It was because he knew them so deeply that he could dismantle them so effectively. His attack was not blind rejection, but sharp dissection, a surgeon's scalpel applied to a body swollen with pride. The philosophers of his time, heirs of Aristotle and followers of Avicenna, argued that the human intellect, disciplined through logic, could discover all that mattered. They proposed that the world was eternal, that causality was fixed, that divine knowledge was limited to generalities, and that the resurrection of the body was an impossibility. They claimed to climb toward truth on the rungs of demonstration, and they dazzled many with their confidence. To their admirers, they represented the pinnacle of wisdom, the fusion of reason and faith. But Al-Ghazali saw something different. He saw a dangerous overreach, the attempt of finite minds to seize what belongs only to the infinite. He titled his great critique, Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. The title itself was deliberate. They claimed coherence, unity, perfect systems. He showed incoherence, contradiction, collapse. One of his most pointed critiques was of their claim that the world had no beginning, that creation was eternal. Avicenna, following Aristotle, had argued that an eternal God must produce an eternal effect, just as the sun, existing eternally, gives off eternal light. To them, it seemed impossible that an eternal being could suddenly choose to create after not creating. But Al-Ghazali struck at the heart of this reasoning. He asked, "Who are we, bound by time, to dictate how an eternal God must act? Why should divine will be limited to the categories of human logic. To insist that God must create in the way that makes sense to us is not philosophy but arrogance. It is reducing the infinite to the scale of the finite. He also dismantled their doctrine of causality. Aristotle had described the world as a chain of causes and effects, each following necessarily from the one before. Avicenna and his followers expanded this into a full cosmology, in which everything flowed necessarily from God through a series of emanations. To them, when fire touches cotton, the burning follows by necessity. But Ghazali refused this. Fire does not burn cotton by itself, he argued. God burns the cotton when fire touches it. What appears as natural necessity is, in truth, divine habit. God creates the burning each time, moment by moment. If he wished, he could touch fire to cotton and create no flame. The regularity of the world is not a chain of necessity, but the mercy of God's consistency. This was not only metaphysics, it was about the immediacy of God in creation. For the philosophers, God was distant, an initial cause whose influence filtered down through layers of necessity. For Ghazali, God was present in every moment, sustaining the world directly, intimately. Their God was a cold abstraction. His God was the living reality upon which everything rests. Perhaps his fiercest rejection was reserved for their denial of bodily resurrection. Avicenna had claimed that the soul was immortal, but that the body, being material, would not rise again. Resurrection, he argued, must be purely spiritual. To Al-Ghazali, this was not only heretical but absurd. Revelation had promised resurrection of both body and soul, and the power of God was not limited by philosophical notions of possibility. To deny the body was to reduce divine power to the measure of human speculation. He listed 20 points on which the philosophers strayed, and he declared 3 of them beyond forgiveness: the claim of the world's eternity, the denial of God's knowledge of particulars, and the rejection of bodily resurrection. These, he said, placed them outside the circle of Islam. He was not speaking of minor errors, but of betrayals that struck at the core of revelation. Yet even in his severity, Al-Ghazali's critique carried subtlety. He did not dismiss mathematics or astronomy. He acknowledged that the philosopher's methods could yield reliable results in limited domains. He was not anti-intellectual, he was anti-arrogance. He wanted to show that the tools of reason, though sharp, cannot cut through the veil of divine mystery. Used rightly, they are helpful. Used wrongly, they become idols. His attack shook the philosophical world of Islam. Some thinkers were silenced, others retreated, and still others rose to defend philosophy, like Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, who would later write, "The incoherence of the incoherence." But whether one agreed with him or not, Al-Ghazali forced every philosopher to confront their limits. He reminded them that logic, however impressive, cannot bind God. Imagine him writing late into the night, weighing each phrase, shaping each argument, not with the excitement of a student, but with the gravity of a man who had walked through despair and come out convinced that only revelation is firm. His critique was not merely intellectual fencing. It was the cry of a soul who had seen how reason can falter and how revelation alone sustains. In his hands, philosophy was not destroyed, but humbled, bent back into its proper place. And through that act of humbling, he sought to protect the heart of faith, the certainty that comes not from syllogism, but from divine light. If Al-Ghazali's critique of philosophers was sharp, his engagement with the skeptics was even more urgent. For the philosophers, at least, believed in truth, even if they misplaced its source. But the skeptics doubted everything. They whispered that nothing could be known, that all was illusion, that meaning itself might be a human invention. To live with such doubt was, in Al-Ghazali's eyes, to live in despair. And despair was poison to the soul. He knew their arguments intimately, because he had lived them. His own collapse in Baghdad had left him staring into the abyss of skepticism. He had doubted the senses, doubted reason, doubted theology, doubted even his own faith. He knew what it felt like to wake in the morning and wonder if anything was certain, to speak words aloud and feel them hollow. He knew the paralysis that skepticism produces, when the soul can neither trust nor move, when every step seems unsupported. And yet, he also knew that skepticism cannot be the end. It can purify, but it cannot sustain. It strips away illusions, but it leaves nothing to build upon. It clears the ground, but if nothing rises upon it, the ground becomes a wasteland. Skepticism is useful as a medicine against false certainty, but as a permanent condition, it is death. To the skeptics, who said that perception deceives, he replied that, yes, perception is limited, but it is not meaningless. The fact that the eye can be mistaken does not mean all sight is false. The fact that dreams can deceive does not mean waking life has no truth. To deny everything because some things mislead is to burn the house because one window is cracked. To those who said that reason contradicts itself, he acknowledged that intellect has limits, but he argued that limits do not abolish value. A lamp cannot light the entire desert, but it can still guide the traveler through the night. Reason may falter before infinity, but within its circle, it remains useful. To deny it entirely is to walk in darkness out of spite for the lamp's weakness. More deeply, he argued that skepticism fails to explain itself. To claim that nothing can be known is already to claim to know something that nothing can be known. The skeptic undermines himself with every word. If meaning is denied, then even the denial becomes meaningless. Skepticism devours itself, collapsing into silence or contradiction. But Al-Ghazali's response was not merely logical. It was existential. He reminded the skeptics that human beings are not built to live in doubt. The soul longs for certainty, as the body longs for food. To starve the soul of meaning is to reduce it to misery. Even the skeptic, when confronted with death, instinctively cries for something beyond himself. Doubt may haunt the mind, but the heart hungers for truth. For him, the cure to skepticism was not more argument, but illumination. He did not expect to persuade skeptics with endless debate, because he knew debate can always be doubted. Instead, he pointed them toward the experience of divine light. Certainty is not won by proving every possible objection false. It is given, like sunlight, dispelling mist. Skepticism can cloud the morning, but when the sun rises, the clouds dissolve on their own. This is what he meant when he said that God casts light into the heart. Against the philosophers, he argued that reason is limited. Against the skeptics, he insisted that revelation and divine illumination restore certainty. He had lived their despair, and he had found the way out, not by denying his doubt, but by surrendering it to the one beyond doubt. The skeptics remained, as they always will, in every age. But his voice carried a gentleness born of experience. He did not mock them. He spoke as one who had sat where they sat, who had felt the paralysis of endless uncertainty, and who now reached back with a hand to guide them forward. He told them, "Meaning is not an illusion. Certainty is not impossible. It is closer than you think. shining already within your heart, if only you will polish it and open it to the light. As you listen, you can feel the rhythm of this truth. Doubt may rise like fog, thick and disorienting, but it is not permanent. Beyond the fog, the sun is always shining. The task is not to banish the fog by force, but to wait for the light and to open yourself to it. This was Al-Ghazali's message to the skeptics, his response to the shadow of despair, that beyond all doubt, only God remains, and in his light, meaning is restored. When Al-Ghazali finally returned to public life, after years of solitude and wandering, he was no longer the man who had once dazzled Baghdad with his quick mind and sharp arguments. The collapse he had endured, the doubts that had paralyzed his voice, the nights of weeping in Damascus and Jerusalem, the silence of prayer in lonely cells, all of it had worked upon him like fire refining gold. He was not stripped of knowledge, but his knowledge had been transfigured. He no longer sought to prove himself in debates or to win admiration with his brilliance. What he carried back into teaching was not the pride of intellect, but the humility of one who had seen the limits of reason and had tasted the sweetness of divine light. In the eyes of the world, his return was quiet. He did not stride back into the capital with fanfare. He did not reclaim his old post at the great Nizamiya of Baghdad, nor resume the life of a court intellectual. Instead, he went back to his home province of Khorasan, to the city of Nishapur, and eventually to Tus, the town of his birth. There, he began to teach once more, but his lectures were no longer the same as before. The man who once sliced apart opponents with dazzling precision now spoke gently, urging his students not only to master arguments, but to tend to their hearts. He still explained law with clarity, but he pressed deeper, asking what each practice did to the soul. He still taught theology, but always with the reminder that truth is not reached by intellect alone, but by God's illumination. Students came in droves, drawn by the reputation he had never fully lost. But those who listened found something different from the fiery debates of the past. They found a man who carried himself with calm, whose words were steady, whose eyes seemed to look beyond the ordinary horizon. They found a teacher who no longer gloried in victory, but who spoke of surrender, of humility, of the need to polish the heart through remembrance. His authority no longer rested on dazzling logic, but on authenticity, on the weight of lived experience. He also wrote more during these years, continuing to shape the Ihya Ulum al-Din, his revival of the religious sciences. He wrote not only for scholars, but for ordinary believers, weaving guidance for daily life with reflections on the diseases of the soul and their cures. His pen became an extension of his new self, measured, sincere, aimed not at intellectual conquest, but at transformation. Each page carried the rhythm of a man who had walked through despair and returned with peace. What marked his return most profoundly was his humility. He could have sought again the grandeur of Baghdad. He could have demanded the admiration of rulers. Instead, he chose a quieter life. He established a small school near his home in Tus, where he taught both students of law and seekers of the spiritual path. His classes were modest, his circle intimate, but the influence that radiated from those gatherings reached far. It was as though he understood that truth does not need the roar of great halls. It needs only a sincere heart and willing ears. He also became more active in reconciling divisions. He sought to heal the rift between scholars of law and Sufis, showing each that they needed the other. He reminded jurists that rituals are empty without inner sincerity, and he reminded mystics that sincerity must be disciplined by law. His presence itself was a bridge, for he embodied both traditions. In this way, His return was not only a personal restoration, but a gift to the entire community, stitching back together fragments that had drifted apart. Yet, for all this outward teaching, his inner life remained one of constant remembrance. He never forgot the collapse that had humbled him. He never forgot the paralysis that had silenced him. He knew that doubt could return if he allowed pride to re-enter his heart, and so he guarded his inner life with vigilance, praying long into the night, keeping his heart turned toward God, polishing the mirror daily. His teaching was alive because it flowed not only from intellect, but from ongoing spiritual practice. In 1111, at the age of 53, Al-Ghazali passed away quietly in Tus. On the morning of his death, he performed the ritual ablution, prayed, and wrapped himself in his shroud. He recited words of remembrance, lay down, and surrendered his soul. Those who were with him said he left with peace upon his face, as though his long journey of searching, collapsing, wandering, and reviving had come at last to its rest. The man who had once been the proof of Islam died not in the blaze of fame, but in the stillness of faith, inwardly alive to the end. His return to teaching had been more than a career resumption. It was a transformation. He had shown that collapse is not the end, that wandering can heal, that revelation can restore, and that teaching, when rooted in humility, can breathe new life into faith. His return was the flowering of a soul that had once been broken, and it left behind a legacy that would ripple across centuries. Centuries have passed since Al-Ghazali laid down his pen and closed his eyes for the final time. The world around us has changed beyond recognition. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have reshaped life. New philosophies have emerged and faded. And yet, his voice continues to echo, carried across time, reminding us of something that remains constant: the fragility of human reason and the enduring presence of the eternal. Why does his struggle still speak to us? Perhaps because his questions are our questions. In every age, human beings wrestle with doubt. We ask what can be trusted, what is certain, what lies beyond appearances. We rely on our senses, only to discover how easily they mislead. We rely on our reason, only to find it faltering when it faces infinity. We build systems of knowledge, only to watch them crumble with the next discovery. In this cycle, we recognize ourselves in Ghazali, who once stood at the height of learning and felt it collapse beneath him. His legacy is not a rejection of knowledge, but a humbling of it. He reminds us that science, philosophy, and argument are precious tools, but they are not the foundation of meaning. They can explain processes, predict outcomes, and open astonishing insights into the natural world. But they cannot tell us why we exist, why love and beauty matter, why death feels so heavy, or why the soul longs for what nothing finite can satisfy. When reason reaches its edge, Ghazali's voice whispers, "There is more. Beyond reason, there is revelation. Beyond intellect, there is the heart. Beyond all doubt, there is the eternal." This is why his writings continue to be read not only in the Muslim world but beyond it. His honesty about doubt resonates with anyone who has felt uncertainty. His insistence on divine light resonates with anyone who has glimpsed beauty too deep for words. His call to polish the heart resonates with anyone who has felt weighed down by distraction and longed for clarity. His legacy is not limited to a single faith or culture. It belongs to the human condition itself. At the same time, his life offers a model of courage. It is not easy to walk away from fame, wealth, and admiration. It is not easy to confess that the intellect you once trusted has failed you. It is not easy to abandon the comforts of certainty and step into silence. Ghazali did all of this, not because he despised knowledge, but because he loved truth more than reputation. His courage lay not in conquering others, but in confronting himself, in admitting collapse, and in seeking a foundation deeper than pride. In our own world, where distraction is constant and doubt is widespread, his example offers guidance. He would tell us, "Do not fear doubt, for it can strip away illusions. But do not linger in doubt, for it cannot feed the soul. Seek the balance, use reason, but do not worship it. Honor ritual, but do not let it become empty. Tend the heart, polish it daily, so that it can reflect the light of the eternal." In this way, meaning is not lost, but renewed, not manufactured, but revealed. To hear his story as you drift toward rest is to feel less alone in your own uncertainties. You are reminded that even the greatest minds have faltered. Even the most celebrated teachers have doubted. And yet, out of that faltering, something greater can emerge. Out of collapse can come renewal. Out of silence can come illumination. Al-Ghazali's legacy is not a system frozen in time. It is a path, a way of walking, a rhythm of humility and hope. It speaks across centuries because it points not to himself but to God, not to argument but to revelation, not to pride but to surrender. His life says to us, "When reason fails, do not despair, for only the eternal remains, and in him, certainty is found." And so we reach the end of tonight's journey with Al-Ghazali. His doubts, his search, and his surrender to the eternal remind us that peace is possible, even when reason falters. Now, allow your eyes to close, your breath to deepen, and your heart to rest. Sleep well, and let the stillness of the night refresh your soul. If you are still awake, you can continue the journey by clicking on one of the two videos on your screen. And if you found comfort here, remember to subscribe so you'll never miss another night of wisdom and rest.